Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Smithsonian Social Studies online webcast. We are so thrilled to have all of you here with us this morning, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you happen to be. We are so thrilled. Excuse me. Today, our topic is Black History Month, and we have two really exciting guests who are going to be talking to you about different aspects of this topic, and also they're here to answer your questions. So we encourage you to share comments and questions using the chat box, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Please, your questions are welcome. We'll answer them as we can. We do have some guidelines though. We ask that you keep all private information private. We don't need to know it. And we ask that you keep our conversations respectful today. This is our shared history, and it's important that we come together in this moment to talk about it. If you have any questions about the Smithsonian's terms of use for asking questions and sharing in the chat, a link to that is included in the comments section that describes this webcast. With that, I'm so thrilled to turn it over to my colleague, Orlando Serrano, to run our show.
Thank you, Abby, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us. And we are very excited to have our guest with us today and have a wonderful 30-minute conversation about Black History Month, our shared history. And with that, we do want to let you know who is going to be with us today, and then they will introduce themselves and share a little bit about the work that they do and some of the projects that they're working on. So we will be speaking with Mary Elliott, who is with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Chris Wilson, who is with the National Museum of American History. And Mary, welcome. Thank you for being with us. Can you please share a little bit about your work that you do over at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the research, some of the projects that you're working on?
Well, thank you, Orlando, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this program. I'm really excited, and I'm excited about collaborating with my colleagues at American History. This is all one big family, right? So I have the pleasure of serving as the curator of American slavery at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I want to clarify something with that title, American slavery, because truthfully, when we think of America, oftentimes people think just North America, but it's important to note that there's South America, there's Central America, and then the United States itself is also part of a larger diaspora. So my title is Curator of American Slavery. The other thing is I had the pleasure of co-curating the Slavery and Freedom exhibition in the National Museum of African American History and Culture with my former colleague and now your colleague at American History, Dr. Nancy Burkaw, who is, I understand, the chair of your Department of Political History, dynamic scholar, as well as with the work of another one of your colleagues, Sion Wolde-Michael, who is your social justice curator, I understand. So you all have some great people on your team, and it was my honor to be able to do this work with them. So thank you so much for having me again today. And what I do is I collect stories, I collect artifacts, I do visual storytelling. I bring these stories to life for the public to really understand and reflect on this history and be better informed and engaged and think about how to move forward as really thoughtful citizens. So it's my pleasure to be able to do that work.
Thank you. And I appreciate you giving a shout out to Nancy and Sion, who are two colleagues who I enjoy working with. And thank you for sharing them with us, because it's been great to work with them. But now we're excited to hear about your contributions to this work as well. And so as we start looking at a couple of the artifacts that you brought with us to share with us, we're going to do something called See, Think, Wonder. And this is really an exercise that we do with some of our guests to help us and folks who join us online think about how to analyze and think through visual and material culture. So we have this artifact in front of us, and I'm going to ask you three quick questions. So first, what is it that you see here when you were out doing the work that you do as a curator and collecting stories? What did you see here?
So now, for the person who does the curatorial work, I see a historic structure.
Okay.
And for the person who's just Mary, I also see a structure that probably is covered with spiders and snakes. So those are the ways that I see things, and I have to reconcile the two because I'm also the person that when I'm doing the curatorial work, I have to go, yeah, there's probably spiders and snakes in there, but I'm gonna have to go in and make sure it's a slave cabin.
I appreciate you explaining how sometimes your professional and your personal life clash when you're out doing this work in the field. All right, well, let me ask two more questions. Now, you see the structure, it's historical, right? We see some wood that's tearing away from the original structure. What do you think about that? And then what does it make you wonder?
So it makes me think when you come to this work, you bring your experiences and what you've learned. And my experience was doing research on many things related to slavery before I came to the Smithsonian. And I saw cabins like this across the landscape of the US, right? And what I think is, what was the footprint of this landscape? What else was around this space? Because when I saw that, it was sitting there by itself. But I knew that it wasn't just some random building just sitting there. And so what I instantly thought was, what happened here? I instantly thought, what was it like, being in that structure? And I thought about, is this the original structure? Was there stuff added to it? Was it painted? I know you said see, think, feel, but I also knew that that roof was not the original roof, because I also had in my backpack of knowledge the understanding of tenant farmers after slavery ended, that people ended up living back in those very same slave cabins.
Okay. Thank you for sharing some of your thinking and the process you went through in looking at and starting to do the historical work of contextualizing this. And so let's look at a couple images here, and as we start to unravel the story, who are these two folks here in this image in front of this cabin?
Well, we had the pleasure of having two of the women who were personally familiar with the cabins, and this is a really powerful story. That cabin was built in the 1850s. They were slave cabins. They were used for slavery. They were used to essentially house people, no different than how they penned up animals at night. They stored their people, their property, and men and women in these cabins. And as generations passed and slavery ended, people went into those cabins and made it a home, for lack of a better word, as they were working in the fields on a contract basis. And these two women knew this house as a home.
Wow.
They didn't know of it as a slave cabin. And the woman in the white shirt is Emily Meggett. And the Meggett family is affiliated with Point of Pines Plantation, which is where this slave cabin is from, in Edisto Island, South Carolina. And then sitting next to her is her sister-in-law, Isabella Meggett Lucas. Isabella actually lived in the cabin. And so that cabin was inhabited until 1981. It had no running water, no heat, no electricity. And so they talked about this cabin. They said, we knew of it as a home. We didn't think of it as a slave cabin. And so that's a really interesting thing to think about, how these stories are passed down through the generations and the things that we assume about something we see in our family and everyday lives, but we don't realize the depth of history that's attached to it.
Yeah, and thank you for. I always tell folks, like, this was not a long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, this history is still with us, and this history being specifically the enslavement of many of our community members. And I appreciate the way that you started to situate this within the larger national narrative. And then, so my last question, as we turn to our final images, how do you then tell this story at the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
Well, we were pretty intentional about how we set up the this part of the exhibition featuring the slave cabin. The cabin is what we consider a jewel in the crown. It is the actual cabin was dismantled, conserved, and then put back together. So imagine putting the pieces of a puzzle together. As they took it apart, they stamped each piece to mark it and then knew how to put it back together. We decided not to put furniture in there. We decided not to stage it. We wanted the visitor to be able to imagine what that must have been like. The elements outside, being enslaved, growing a garden on the side of the cabin to supplement your diet, knowing that you were under surveillance at all times, and even being subject to violence as a woman in that cabin. So we wanted to give it a spare treatment. So that's what we did. And we interpret it from all angles, from the perspective of the humanity of the people who lived in the structure, the perspective of the business person who saw them as property, including the land and the building itself, and then the perspective of looking at it from as a larger story about that period in the nation. So, and we set it up where it's life, work, and enslavement, and it gives you kind of that feel.
Thank you, Mary. We are gonna thank you for talking with us about the Point Defiance cabin and situating it within a larger moment in time and connecting it to a very contemporary moment. Before we move on to our next artifact, we do have a question. Abby, what's going on?
Sure. We have an interesting question in the chat. Did the inhabitants have to pay rent?
Well, as an enslaved person, no. And tenant farmers, they did an exchange for having the land, to work the land and a place to live. And they were responsible for growing a certain amount of crops. And the bad part was that they lived on this contract agreement that you got things on credit. So you would cultivate your crops. You had a promise that you would bring in X amount of, commodity that was worth a certain dollar value, and you bought things on credit. If you didn't meet that dollar value, then you ended up in debt. And so that was the system immediately following slavery. And essentially it felt like another form of slavery. So that's from that period, from slavery to Reconstruction. And even beyond Reconstruction, because tenant farming went on for a while.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question, folks out there. And thank you, Mary, for the answer. We're going to turn here to our second artifact here. We've got this image, again, that we want to break down and explain a little bit. Can you say who this is in this picture and what she's holding? And then we'll dig in a little bit deeper about what this artifact she is holding actually is about.
Okay, and I'll be brief because I know we have only so much time. But when I look at this, I see someone who I care about deeply, and her name is Elaine Thompson, and I see her holding something that to her is very precious, and so that's what I see.
And what is she holding? This is what I appreciate the cabin. Every time I see this artifact, I know what it is, but please share what it is for other folks. This still catches me completely off guard every time.
Yeah, it's a little mind-blowing because, again, there are things that we have in our families that we take for granted sometimes. And particularly for marginalized communities, African Americans in this case, they've been told that their history is not, that thing that you have is just mundane. It's not a big deal. But this family knew that what they had was of great value, and it's passed down through the generations. And Ms. Thompson was the last family member to be responsible for the caring for this object. It is a handmade tin wallet produced by her ancestor named Joseph Trammell. He was a free man in Loudoun County, Virginia. We're not clear whether he was enslaved prior to 1852, which is the date on the document. But we do know that in Loudoun County, Virginia, he had to register his freedom every 2 years. So why did he need to make a tin wallet? Because those papers inside of that wallet are his freedom papers. He had to have a white person witness to say that he was a credible person. And he had to have that registered every 2 years and carry those documents with him. They could have been destroyed. It would have been his own copy, his only copy. And if he didn't have those papers, he could be accused of being a runaway enslaved person. and he could have been placed in the slave trade. So he knew he had to protect them at all costs, and he made this tin wallet to hold on to, essentially to hold on to his freedom, protect his freedom.
Yeah, and a little bit, the story in itself is powerful. The idea that one has to show proof of freedom, and then the contemporary connections that we know and are aware of with the need for folks to show their identification or their papers to now is profound. And to see the great care that someone took to make something metal that's not destructible, that will last a long time, to ensure the safety of these materials.
Right.
And not far from here, if you're in DC or Virginia, that's not far at all.
No. And I should tell you that briefly, Ms. Thompson had basically an archive in her house, a museum in her house of all this family material. And so just like we talked about the cabin, slavery to freedom, emancipation, what happened next, her family, upon gaining, freedom, and they helped build a community in Loudoun County, Virginia, and particularly in a place called Purcellville, Virginia. And it is there that they became successful business leaders, community members, building churches and schools. And they created a park called Emancipation Park. There are emancipation parks all over the country, but that is a park where African Americans came together annually to celebrate their moment of freedom in the nation. And so it's still there, and we have to applaud that effort.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. To transition us to this last couple of set of images, these are images of gatherings. Can you share a little bit about what they are and why you brought them to share with us today?
Because I have told you all about these families. And I am a professional, but I am also me. And what brought me to this profession and my interest and passion in this history is everything that comes with me, my family, my education, who I identify as a person, as an African-American woman. And so this image is part of the impetus for why I'm in my position. This is an image of my family at an annual Elliott family reunion. In the front row, sitting off to the side, is my dad. He's sitting right behind the girl with the bow in her hair. And then my uncle is sitting center behind my cousin Patty with the two bows in her hair. And my grandparents are in the back. And so we had annual family reunions. Our family originates from South Carolina. They were enslaved in South Carolina, forced across to Mississippi, fought during Reconstruction for their rights to hold on to them, and then went to Indian Territory and built an enterprise of businesses, built communities, and they were very successful there. And it later became the state of Oklahoma. They actually are associated with the Tulsa Race Massacre. They lost a business there. The picture that you see there is my cousin Ava. My first cousin Kathy is a musician, and she teaches music down in Ecuador. And so she got married, had her daughter Ava, and they had one of their rare visits up to DC. And Ava came in and was able to see our story in the museum because a colleague, our former interim director, Spencer Crew, and former director of NMAH, American History, asked if he could use this image of my family. So who you see there are my great-grandparents in that photograph, along with my aunts and uncles, and my grandfather is the infant sitting on my great-grandmother's lap.
Oh, wow. Mary, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your story, literally your story, with us, and the work that you're doing at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Side note, I also appreciate that you situated the United States within the Americas as someone who also thinks about the Americas writ large and the impact of the African diaspora across all this region. I appreciate you doing that as well. All right, Mary, we're gonna see you in a few minutes. Right now, we're gonna take a break. So Bye, Mary. See you in a little
Thank
bit.
you. See you shortly.
We're going to ask our next guest to come on and introduce himself. And Chris, thank you for being with us. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Orlando and Abby. I'm Chris Wilson. I'm Director of Experience Design at the National Museum of American History. And so what that really means is being running the team or overseeing the team that engages with the visitors on a daily basis at the museum during the day. So everything from our tours to our talks to our theater programs to any number of programs that we do during the day at the museum.
Thank you. And how long have you been at NMH, and what brought you to us and the work that you do?
So I've been at the American History Museum for 17 years and started in 2004. I came originally to run the African American History and Culture program at the American History Museum, a program that had been part of the museum since the late 70s. Founded by Bernice Johnson Reagan, who also founded Sweet Honey in the Rock and was a member of the Civil Rights Movement. Our goals in that program were to document and collect and present programming around particularly the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, and particularly from a cultural standpoint, as well as telling the story from the perspective of people with living memory of that program. And then since then, I've moved on to still doing those programs, but also taking on wider topics and wider styles of engagement with the public.
Wonderful. Chris, before we move on and talk a little bit about your work and the wider engagement that you have been doing recently at NMAH, Abby, there's a question.
Yes, thank you. We had a great question about Juneteenth to say, is there any progress to making Juneteenth a national holiday?
Chris, are you able to help us with that question before we talk about your work?
You know, I mean, I think that it was really wonderful last year when so many more people found out about the history of Juneteenth, and I think that expansion. I ended up doing a session, a podcast about its history last year. Our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, did as well. I think the information about Juneteenth really exploded. Interestingly, before I came to the Smithsonian, I worked at Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. We focused then on telling the history of emancipation celebrations. Emancipation celebrations. Juneteenth was an emancipation celebration. In the 19th century, Mary was talking quite a bit about the post-emancipation period in the United States and Reconstruction and so forth. And during that time, it was very common for African American communities across the country to put on emancipation celebrations. Again, Juneteenth was one, but there were others on the anniversary of emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation, or the 13th Amendment. That was a really important part of the culture of African Americans in the 19th century, and it sort of faded away. And I'm really glad that we've, as a culture, remembered that history, that social element of remembering the history, public element of the remembering the history that was a really big part of African Americans especially in the late 19th century. I don't know if how it's going in terms of pushing that forward as a national holiday. I know a lot of state governments have already put Juneteenth in as state holidays and so forth. So I imagine as that increases in information about it and knowledge about that history increases, we'll get more movement toward that. The thing that I really like about it is that it's never too late to look back and remember our history differently. The history has always been there, like what happened in the 19th century and the fact of those emancipation celebrations existing. Historians have known about that. People have known about that in their family, but we forgot it as in a public way, I think. And so I think as we are remembering different elements of our history and presenting that memory in different ways, we're going to get, I think it's good for all of us.
Thank you, Chris, for that explanation and answer. And I appreciate the way that you were saying we can think about our history differently. And full disclosure, folks out there, we're having some technical difficulty with Learning Lab at the moment. A couple of tiles that we had put as part of our collection are not showing up. So we're improvising as we're moving along here. And in the vein of talking about how we can think and present our history differently, Chris, what is this that we have here? We know that it says the Greensboro lunch counter, but can you tell us the story behind this? And then we'll talk about how we're thinking about that differently in our museum.
So this is a section of a lunch counter from a Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina. This was collected by the museum in the mid-90s when the Woolworth's department stores started to close down and change. That company started changing its focus, and so we were able to collect a piece of this larger lunch counter. There's a lot, the lunch counter was stretched for 50-some seats, so it was a really long lunch counter, and we collected this 4-seat portion of it. The reason we collected a 4-seat portion of this lunch counter was because this was the lunch counter where on February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American students from North Carolina A&T University sat down at this segregated lunch counter that only served whites and asked to be served. They were not served. When their service was refused, they just kept sitting there, and then came back the next day and the next, and more people joined, and it really launched a movement that brought more young people into the civil rights movement. So a lot of times people ask, was this the first sit-in? It was not. Sit-ins at lunch counters had happened in the 1950s and the late 1950s. The sit-ins were, really the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case in the 19th century came from Homer Plessy sitting down in a segregated section of a streetcar in New Orleans. And so the idea of sit-ins was not new. What was new was what happened on February 2nd and 3rd and 4th and for 6 months, and how many people became part of this movement.
And thank you for providing the background and information for folks who maybe don't know the full story of what made this a little bit different than previous sit-ins. And the follow-up question that we have is, how are you working in NMAH to present this history differently for folks so that it's more experiential?
Right. So more than 10 years ago now, we started a program called Join the Student Sit-ins. And one of the things that I really added initially as part of the African American program and then sort of wider at the museum was using museum theater to engage people in the history and also engage people with one another. I really agree with our secretary, Lonnie Bunch, when he says, people live in bubbles today, and the Smithsonian and history has an opportunity to break through that and get people to engage with one another, understand one another, talk to one another. So what we say is, like, all of our programs at the museum are really targeted toward empowering people. We can empower people with new information, but even more, I think we can empower people by connecting them with one another. Mm. So we use lots of tools to do that. One of them is theater. What we tried to do when we started the program, Join the Student Sit-ins, at this lunch counter and online. We have online versions which people can take part in. And what we tried to do was say, well, the story isn't just the story of what happened on February 1st, 1960, because lots of times people violated segregation rules and laws and tried to make changes, but those were often swept away. What we wanted to do was tell the story of the ongoing commitment that it took to turn this moment of courage of the Greensboro Four into a long-term movement that would have change, and how every single person, not just the people that sat in the stools on the first day, but every single person who ever attended one of these sit-ins or a training session around the sit-ins or helped spread the word about sit-ins and through outreach and so forth, and they didn't have Twitter and Instagram and so forth at the time, but had to get the word out and so forth. All of those people made decisions to affect the future of this nation, and they put their bodies on the line to force a change nonviolently in this country, even though the reason that they were brought to it was they were angry. They still turned to nonviolence to do this. So what we want to do is take that theater program and put people in the position of going through a training program to participate in a sit-in. And we really believe that there's lots of different types of learning. Theater can really help us with emotional learning, so that people come out of that program with a feeling of understanding that is different than you would get if you read about it or watched a movie about it or something like that. So that that act of learning is really important to us.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for mentioning the resource that is available online. For folks who are joining us now or later on, we are going to make those resources available as part of this learning lab. The URL will appear in the chat. And it is called Join the Student Sit-ins. And it is a classroom resource that you're able to use to think through everything that Chris just mentioned. All right, we're going to talk about one of your other programs. Can you tell us what is going on here? I see October 30, 1961.
Yeah, so coming up on 60 years after this. This was a dramatization of a debate between Malcolm X, the actor on the right is playing Malcolm X, and Bayard Rustin, who the actor on the left is playing. This took place at Howard University in October 1961. It was the first time that Malcolm X had gone to an HBCU, historically black college university at Howard. And they had this debate where the student body was invited to participate in this debate, where they were looking at how the civil rights movement should move forward. Should it move forward trying to trying to work toward integration, or, as Malcolm X was arguing, should we be thinking about separation? Should we decide that integration just wasn't possible? And so this was a topic that one of my colleagues in the political history division at the American History Museum had suggested maybe we should try to dramatize in a theater program. To me, a number of years ago, more than 10 years ago, we were thinking about it. Debates like this were a really important part of on television in the early 60s and through the early part of the 60s. And Malcolm X was very involved with a lot of them, debating people like Bayard Rustin as well as others. And, I thought this was a really interesting story. But what was the sort of nugget or the kernel that I sort of wanted to take away was this was a story certainly about these two giants of the civil rights movement who were going head to head on the stage at Crampton Auditorium at Howard. But more than that, I was interested in how this came to be, how they got there. And what I really found out that the story really was about the students at Howard who decided that not enough of their classmates were engaged in the debates of the moment, and they wanted to get more people involved. The way we often think of the civil rights movement is Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King gave a speech, the Greensboro Four did the things that they did, and then everybody just joined in. And if I were there, I would have joined in. I would have been on those front lines. Well, when you look at polls, when you look at the way the history was, when you just look at the number of people that were involved in those things, not everybody was involved. It was a big deal to put yourself out there to potentially get injured or killed or jailed or kicked out of college. So students at Howard felt like, it's 1961, the freedom rides are going on. Greensboro sit-ins already happened. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee has been formed, but there's just not enough of us involved in this movement. So they decided that they started something called Project Awareness, which was basically to get their classmates aware or woke. And they thought they'd do a number of these things to bring in people to get these ideas together. And so that's really what the story of the play that I ended up writing, called Crampton 1961, was about. It was about how, a movement like that needs sustenance. It doesn't just, if you look at even things happening today, Black Lives Matter, any movement that we have that is going on, it's not enough to just start it, to just have that initial moment. It takes commitment, it takes organization, it takes strategy, it takes really just marketing, getting other people involved and engaged in the moment, and willing to step out of their ordinary lives and move into activism. And so that's what the story of Crampton really was. It was taking these giants of the movement, but also getting the classmates, getting the whole Howard community of students more involved in activism.
Thank you, Chris. And folks, we do see a couple of questions in the chat. We're going to get to them in just a moment. We're going to wrap up our time here with Chris, and we're going to bring Mary on in just a second. But before we head out, Chris, I know there's another program that we're working on that you're leading called the Time Trials series. Can you please tell us a little bit about that and how it's transforming from an in-museum experience to an experience folks can have in their own homes?
Yes, thank you, Orlando. Another program series is our Time Trial series. We began this, again, about 10 years ago at the museum, taking people from the past, sometimes ideas or events of the past, and putting them on trial. But we're not putting them on trial about what they did or didn't do in the past. We're looking at what their legacy is, how they are and should be remembered in the present. So we say, when we have that little tagline that was just up there with "History is on trial, only time can be the judge." And one of the things that you have to realize is, again, there's history, there's what happened in the past. There's history as defined as the work of professional historians to figure out, to use evidence to try to understand better what had happened in the past. And then there's memory. There's how we remember what happened in the past. And two people can completely agree on the facts of the case and what happened in the past on someone like, and think about this related to a Confederate monument or something like someone like Robert E. Lee. Some people can completely agree about what happened in the past and completely disagree on whether we name a school after that person today, whether we name a street after that person today, how we remember that person, or that event. And so what we decided to do is use theater to explore that. We always say we want to use theater for what it's good at doing. And it's not necessarily the best thing of just getting information across, but it is great at exploring emotion and so forth. And that idea of how we remember history is a very emotional, sometimes almost a quasi-religious thing. And so we've done a number of in-person programs, as you said, Orlando, like the Time Trial of John Brown, which was our longest running time trial, and it is available online as well. We've seen teachers take this idea of time trials and do it in their own classroom with their own people. We know one of our favorite teachers who's worked with us for a long time started doing a time trial of President Andrew Jackson in his room, in schoolroom, and had the kids take the different points of view of how we should remember a person like Andrew Jackson. So we have those resources available, and it's a great way to think through, how memory and how the way we think about and commemorate history changes over time, which is why we put up monuments and then maybe take down monuments and do things like that. Because while the history is the history, the remembrance of it is always being reinterpreted. And that's how we understand the present many times.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now working to create time trials in a new genre, which will be graphic novels. So we're working with the publisher IDW, who quite famously did George Takei's graphic novel look at his family's internment in the World War II as a Japanese American. They published John Lewis's March series of graphic novels looking at the civil rights movement. We are now going to be producing time trial books that look at people like Thomas Jefferson, like Susan B. Anthony, like Malcolm X, and invite readers and students to rethink the different ways that we can look back at the past and use it to understand the present.
Thank you very much, Chris. All right, folks, look for that coming soon, and they will join. I have the George Takei novel, and I have the March series, so I'm sure that will be joining my young adult section at home. And I'm going to ask Mary to come back up and join us. We have a couple of questions that we do want to get to. So one of the folks asked, is there any outreach being done with Black Lives Matter movement? Chris brought it up earlier. One of the contemporary social movements. What work is being done between Smithsonian and that movement?
Well, I understand collaboratively, our museum and National Museum of American History have been engaged in conversations with Black Lives Matter, with Black youth, the Black Youth 100 organization. And so I know that there is an effort in terms of helping to think through how they conserve some of their materials, how they document this moment in time, and how they make it accessible for the public. Because if you think back to here, you have Chris, who's done a phenomenal job, and you're talking about these conversations at Howard Crampton Auditorium, HU, because that's where I went. But, you're looking back on those moments. And so, wow, what people would have thought of back then about, I need to save this, or I need to think about it in this way. So it's important to capture the moment. History is history, but it doesn't mean you can't start preserving it now for, years down the road. So that's some of the stuff that I know we've all been engaged in conversations with them about, as well as, like I said, collecting artifacts so that we can have them for sharing in our different exhibition spaces.
Okay. Well, I do want to thank you all for your time today. We went a little bit over and I don't want to keep you. I know you all are doing important work, but I do want to ask one more question that one of our educators asked as part of our newsletter that folks can subscribe to if they're interested. And their question was, what are ways that you suggest to celebrate Black History Month? What are some tangible things people can do?
Well, I'm going to let Chris go first because I talk a lot, but I have something in mind. But I'll let you go first.
Well, I think that one of the things that, well, first of all, I would say, I think it's important to think back to why Black History Month exists in the first place. Mary mentioned some of her colleagues from the African American Museum have moved over and are working with us at the American History Museum. We're looking at the how history can that basically the way we remember history has power. Black History Month was started by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in the 1920s as really part of a larger movement that was called the New Negro Movement, which looked at, and the Harlem Renaissance came out of that and so forth. And when one of the things that they were looking at was, how can we get America to think of African Americans as human, as part of the United States? And people like Woodson, people like W.B. Du Bois and so forth thought, well, one of those ways is what happened with the Harlem Renaissance. Can we promote Black art, literature, music, even sports? The Harlem Wrens and the Harlem Globetrotters came out of that time. Can we demonstrate that we African Americans have as much potential as anybody else, and are fully part of this of this nation? Well, Carter G. Woodson was saying, were part of this nation's past. African Americans were systematically taken out of the national narrative, and so the initial goals of Black History, originally called Negro History Week, were to do something about that. When Carter Woodson got to Harvard and said he wanted to study Black history, he was laughed at and said, there's no such thing as Black history. My mother, who was born in 1930, had the same experience that Malcolm X had when he was in class and said he wanted to be a lawyer. She was told that, and also told, when you look at Black history, there's no such thing. It's not really a part of this nation. So I think that's one thing that's important for me in this moment. I think it's fine to share like achievements of the past and so forth, but it's also really important, I think, during Black History Month to remember that the reason that there is a Black History Month is that Black history was destroyed, and I think that, and we have to remember that the way we remember things has power. And that's, to me, where we get into questions about memorialization and so forth, because, we've as a nation remembered the history of our country differently than African Americans would remember it. So I think that's really important to me as a way to think through what one should do during a Heritage Month like Black History Month.
Well, so I'll just add this, and Chris, I'm glad you brought up about Carter G. Woodson and his founding of the of what was Black History Week and then became Black History Month, and it was a way to educate the public on the significant contributions of African Americans. And speaking of that, he was also the founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History that comes out annually with the annual theme for Black History Month. This year's theme is the Black family. I'm forgetting the full title, but it's a Black family identity, and it has two other words with it. What's important for educators is to know that you can go onto the ASALH website, and there is curriculum available and resources available on the ASALH website. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of good book lists coming out that are circulating for supplementing curriculum that you have in the class, right? There's the recent release. We just launched the book that was recently written, very simple, straightforward essays written by 80 writers, including scholars, journalists, and others, as well as 10 poets contributing to this book, called 400 Souls, looking at history from 1619 to 2019. And it was edited by two dynamic scholars, Keisha Blaine and Ibram Kendi, that just launched yesterday or the day before yesterday. And so just taking some of those essays that are 4 to 5 pages, very short, and really thinking about some of this history. And the last thing I will say is thinking about how we can have a more inclusive history and how this history was segregated in the past. So if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend to each of you to look up the information regarding the Daughters of the Confederacy, and their impact on creating curriculum that left out the contributions of African Americans, and also the impact on developing Confederate monuments. That is also part of this story as to why we're having to revisit history and make it more inclusive and get people to fully understand all of the many ways that many marginalized communities help to bring this nation into being.
Thank you very much, Mary, for wrapping up our time together, and thank you, Chris, for also introducing Carter G. Woodson for folks who maybe are not familiar. And check out those books that Mary mentioned. We will put some of those resources together in this Learning Lab link that's here at the bottom of the page. And for the folks who ask when the books will be published, we're hoping the first one will be out in 2022. So look for that. It's going to come sooner than you think. And I want to thank you all for being with us and remind you that in 2 weeks, we're going to have another focus on inventors. And we will be focusing on Black inventors during that time as well to keep our focus on Black History Month going strong. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chris, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you.